So I would like to introduce Chris Williams. I would like to say that Chris has pulled my cookies out of the oven a bunch of times. And one of those times was at Cook, as Betty mentioned. We had a protest rally at Cook. That particular day, we were protesting the fact that American Electric Power was part of a coalition of nuclear utilities that was trying to dump its high-level radioactive waste on an Indian reservation in Utah called the Skull Valley Goshu. It's a tiny tribe, 125 people. They had the dubious distinction of being targeted for what's called a centralized interim storage facility for high-level radioactive waste. 40,000 tons worth, which now there's 70,000 metric tons of commercial waste in this country. They were going to get 40,000 tons of it. And we stopped it, so that's the good news. But that day I pulled up with our nuclear waste parade float, a full-size replica nuclear waste transportation container. And there were a couple people out there, Corey and Carrie, who couldn't make it tonight because the weather had come down from Grand Rapids. And there were a couple more people out in front of Cook, and I was like, we've got 4 people here? And then all of a sudden, out of the woods comes Chris Williams and about 80 people from Citizens Action Coalition of Indiana, just in the nick of time because they sent out a television news camera that day. So that was some pretty sweet footage of a big group out in front of Cook, and we stopped that particular dump. So Chris and his retirement up in Vermont after stopping 2 nuclear power plants in Indiana back in the 1980s as executive director of Citizens Action Coalition, decided to involve himself in the Vermont Yankee fight, and you're going to hear all about that. And what inspired us to hold this event tonight was that Christy Todd Whitman, who was George W. Bush's Environmental Protection Agency administrator, came to West Michigan last October at the behest of Entergy, came to Kalamazoo and gave an interview with the Kalamazoo Gazette where she said, Michigan is not Vermont, and Entergy Palisades is here to stay, and there's nothing you can do about it. And we decided that maybe Michigan needed to be a bit more like Vermont, and maybe we needed to learn a thing or two about how they just, in August of 2013, despite losing in the federal courts in a rigged judicial system, despite losing before a derelict Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and against the stubbornness and arrogance of Entergy Nuclear, headquartered in New Orleans, forced the company to announce the shutdown of Vermont Yankee by the end of this year. So of the 6 shutdowns of atomic reactors in North America in the past year, that was by far the sweetest one for me. Chris is going to tell us all about it, and he's going to tell us how to do it here. Chris Williams.
Thanks, Kevin. And I have to tell you all how nice it is to be back in Michigan. And hopefully I won't be going to jail anywhere tonight, which has happened before when I've come to Michigan. Barry County? 3 times, yeah. No, it really is great to be back in Michigan. Over the years, while I was working in Indiana, I spent quite a bit of time up in Michigan because, you know, Indiana doesn't have any operating nuclear power plants within its borders. Indiana's nuclear power plant is here in Michigan. The DC Cook plant is more or less paid for by captive ratepayers in Indiana. About, last time I checked, about 80% were. So, yeah, I spent a lot of good time here in Michigan, and it's nice to be here in the winter. I've been down in Indianapolis earlier today and yesterday, and they still, you know, I lived there for 25 years, and when it snows in Indianapolis, they just go, oh, it'll melt, and they don't really move any of it. So it was nice when I crossed over the border today in my rental car without snow tires, which is sacrilege in Vermont, and I'm certain it's sacrilege here in Michigan. But I came over the border from Indiana to Michigan, and suddenly the roads transformed. But enough about the roads in Michigan. It's really great to be here, and you know, part of what I've been doing in Vermont for the last 10 years in talking to groups is talking about what we've done and what we're going to do and how we're going to shut it down and how we're going to relate to the next move that Entergy makes. And that's what my presentation's been, and I'm really good at that one. But since August, you know, when we got the news that Entergy's throwing the towel in, I have to come up with a new spiel. So you're kind of like, you know, one of the first audiences outside of Vermont for me to start getting my act together on describing how this wonderful event is about to unfold in Vermont. It's very important, though, to remember, you know, Kevin said, well, we want Michigan to be more like Vermont. Well, when it comes to nuclear power plants, believe me, Vermont and Michigan have a lot more in common than you might think. What we have in common is Entergy Corporation. And specifically, Entergy Corporation's merchant nuclear fleet. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be discussing. And I'm also going to talk about some of the things we did in Vermont over the last, well, the 10 years I've been there, but believe me, there have been people in Vermont fighting Vermont Yankee for over 40 years. There's a lot of happy people in Vermont right now. But there it is. It's sitting there on the Connecticut River. You could almost spit into Massachusetts from here. It's about 7 miles north of the Massachusetts border. The river is actually New Hampshire. New Hampshire pretty much owns the river. But that's Vermont Yankee. It's a General Electric Mark I boiling water reactor. There's the reactor containment building. And it's identical to the reactors at Fukushima Daiichi. But, as the Nuclear Energy Institute likes to remind us every day, what happened in Fukushima can't happen here because, you know, we actually have our act together much better than the Japanese do when it comes to these technical things. Have you heard that one? I know Dave has. Right? So, the beautiful thing, no, it's not a beautiful thing. The thing about this boiling water reactor, unlike Palisades, your pressurized water reactor, is the fuel pool, the spent fuel pool is 6 stories in the air outside of containment. See the white part up there? That's the refueling floor. That's where, at Vermont Yankee, there are 900 tons of high-level waste. 6 stories in the air. It's a nightmare. But, as we're told repeatedly, nothing to worry about. We have confidence in these fuel pools. I was actually at the Waste Confidence meeting in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, and a gentleman from the Nuclear Energy Institute said that Fukushima Daiichi and what happened there absolutely and positively proves that the fuel pools work and that they are durable. That's in the transcript. Anyway, Vermont Yankee. They brought it online back in 1972. It was allowed to go online by a vote of the Vermont legislature, and they had one vote, you know, over the amount they needed to let it go forward. It's had problems galore for decades, and I'm not going to go into them, but it's a long list that dedicated Vermonters and people in Massachusetts and New Hampshire have been keeping and reminding everybody of for decades. And we do that at virtually all the plants that we fight. I got to Vermont 10 years ago, and prior to that, I was in Indiana. And prior to that, I did a little time in Chicago. And prior to that, I did a little time in New York right after I got out of college. And this little piece I want to do right now is designed to hopefully show you that, in fact, we can shut nuclear power plants down.
Right.
It can be a long slog, it can be very discouraging, but it can be done. And it's done all the time, and it's going to continue to get done. The first thing I did out of college was learn how to knock on doors and ask people for money. To raise money for organizing work to, among other things, shut down nuclear power plants. The first door knocking I ever did as a young organizer was on Long Island in suburban New York. And I was talking about the Shoreham nuclear power plant. And people on Long Island revolted because they can't get people to work into New York City on time, much less evacuate 4 million people. And that was the hook. They spent over $6 billion on Shoreham. Ronald Reagan turned it on for low-level power testing for 3 weeks before Governor Mario Cuomo saw to it that the plant was shut down, and the state of New York bought it from the bankrupt utility for $1. Beautiful. I was a youngster, I was very idealistic, and I got a notch in my belt. Okay, this works. In 1982, I had to go to New Hampshire, where of course there were great people doing great things that inspired all of us. At the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant, the Clamshell Alliance people. They had done incredible civil disobedience. There were supposed to be 2 units at Seabrook. They only got to finish 1. And number 2 didn't happen because they ran out of money. The utility, Public Service New Hampshire, went bankrupt. And I set up a door-to-door canvassing operation to fight construction work in progress, or QUIP, which would have made that financing possible. All right, I'm a youngster. I'll put another notch over here for Seabrook too. Then I came out here to the Midwest. I worked on Braidwood for a while in Chicago, and I can't put a notch in my belt for that, but we'll get it, right there? It's coming. I ended up in Indiana, and I was only supposed to be there for 3 weeks, and I ended up there for 25 years. And I had great experiences and great fun there. And the first reactor that went down there was known as Bailey. Bailey was supposed to be at the other end of the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. And they had problems because they were building a nuclear power plant on sand. Somebody should have said, you know, maybe we ought to rethink this sand thing. In any event, they canceled the plant and then tried to get ratepayers in Indiana to pay for it. And that's where my organization, the Citizens Action Coalition, sprang into action. We do a lot of work around money when we fight nuclear power plants. You know, there are a lot of issues, but the one that really matters to the people that own these plants is their money. And we saw to it, we went all the way, we were dragged all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rejected the utilities' attempt to have to give back money that they illegally took from ratepayers for the hole in the ground that was Bailey. We set a precedent there that a plant has to be used and useful in the service of customers before you can make them pay for it. Little Bailey notch there. Meanwhile, at the other end of Indiana, the largest utility in the state was building a plant called Marble Hill down on the Ohio River. Marble Hill bankrupted the largest utility in the state of Indiana. They spent $2.8 billion trying to build the plant. And they had to get a law change in Indiana. They had to get the law changed so they could charge for construction work in progress, which is familiar here in Michigan too, isn't it? If I think back to it, Midland. Yeah, you're Michigan train wreck for nuclear construction. But anyway, we went door to door and we defeated proposals to change the law in Indiana and allow for construction work in progress 4 times. That caused the company to cancel the plant. That was the largest financial cancellation of a nuclear power project in American history. And then we spent over 14 years making sure that ratepayers in Indiana didn't have to pay for it. So with Bailey and Marble Hill out of the way, we said, well, you know, what other nuclear facilities can we deal with here in Indiana? And of course, Cook comes to mind. And we spent a lot of time on Cook because there are a lot of proceedings regarding Cook before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. And my organization, my former organization, spent a lot of time in court over the years on Cook. And it was great back, I could say, it was back, you know, just before the turn of the century. We're in a proceeding around DC Cook over some safety systems that apparently hadn't been operating for like 8 years. Oops. And some of the executives at DC Cook actually, on the advice of their lawyers, didn't feel that they should tell in a deposition what they knew about those safety systems for fear that it might incriminate them. That was a nice settlement. But Cook is still running, and we have a lot of work to do there. So there. I'm just kind of rattling this off, and Kevin talked about some of the other cancellations that have happened this year. But, you know, I'm just trying to make the point that these things really do get turned off and shut down, and that citizens and organizing play a huge, if not instrumental role in making that happen. And I can really say that now with some, you know, some real zeal because of this monstrosity. So when I got to Vermont after 25 years in Indiana, I said, you know, I've been in a trench, fighting a trench war for 25 years. We're going to chill out. Maybe I'm going to grow hops. Or maybe I'm going to make furniture. Or maybe I'm, you know, just going to work at a convenience store. I'm going to forget about these monstrous corporations for a little while. And I was in Vermont about 6 months, breathing the clean air, looking at the beautiful mountains, and somebody that I've known for a long time by the name of Deb Katz, who runs an organization in the Northeast called the Citizens Awareness Network, said, Chris, why don't you come to a meeting? Now I'm an organizer. When you ask somebody to come to a meeting, I know what that's about. And I went, sure. And I haven't looked back. And I have to tell you, in Vermont, we built a huge, in a small state, a huge coalition. It was a big tent deal. I'll just rattle off some of the groups that got in the trench and made this thing happen. The Conservation Law Foundation, Vermont Public Interest Research Group, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, the Citizens Awareness Network, the Clamshell Alliance, Safe and Green, Nuclear Free Vermont, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, the Vermont Yankee Decommissioning Alliance, which has actually been around since just after the plant opened. And I'm leaving some people out, which I'm thinking, I'm getting old. Beyond Nuclear, my comrade here, Mr. Kamps, went to jail in Brattleboro, Vermont more than once. Paul Gunter came up and testified. The Nuclear Information and Resource Service folks were there. Greenpeace brought like 2 organizers into the state, as well as a hot air balloon and a blimp, which they flew over the plant one day. So we built a very large coalition. And the coalition had different, you know, different segments doing different activities. We had groups that did all of the hard, heavy lifting and intervention before the Vermont Public Service Board, our utility regulators. We had groups that formed a sub-coalition that dealt with the Vermont legislature. It was called Safe Power Vermont. And we focused exclusively on the legislature. Then we had groups that were into community organizing and mobilization. We banged on almost every door in Vermont and looked people in the eye, and here was the big, big strategy. If somebody wants to argue about Vermont Yankee, leave. Go away, right? If somebody's kind of like, oh, I don't know, you have to tell me more, give them some information. But if somebody says turn it off, then you sign them up. Straightforward legislative strategy. Vermont's a small place. There's 630,000 people. So, as an organizer, I gotta tell you, I'm living in heaven. The numbers are just incredible. But what we then did was say, well, let's look at the legislature, who's with us and who isn't. And let's concentrate on the people who are with us, instead of wasting a lot of time with legislators that will never move. Now, we built that group, we mobilized it, we made it a political issue. We made it important for every politician in that state to have a position. And when they sat on the fence, we went to their community. And sooner or later, because you're counting heads, we moved a whole lot of the state legislature into our column. The governor, for most of the last 10 years, has been a Republican, which most people don't think of when they think of Vermont. Everybody thinks Vermont is just this, has always been this incredibly progressive place and so on and so forth. Truth is, Vermont was the most solidly voting Republican state in the Union from the Civil War until 1974. Now, there have been demographic shifts and things have changed some, but what we were out to do was make it unpalatable for politicians to support this plan. Now, I'm going to shift here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of this unit and the company that owns it. In 2002, the Vermont utilities, and there aren't that many large utilities in Vermont, Green Mountain Power and Central Vermont Public Service, and some other smaller shareholder organizations or utilities, owned Vermont Yankee for almost 30 years. Much like Consumer Energy and lots of other investor-owned utilities in the mid-90s and late 90s, deregulation, electric deregulation craze in this country, decided, and I just read this the other day on the Consumers Energy website, you know, how great it is to take the liability of a nuclear power plant, especially an aging one, off their balance sheets and sell it to somebody else. That's exactly what they did. It was a fire sale. They unloaded all of these nuclear power plants and said, great, we don't have to deal with it anymore. We may buy the power from it, but we don't have to deal with it anymore. In 2002, Entergy bought the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant for $138 million. They cut a deal with the state of Vermont. They signed a memorandum of understanding. And they said all the wonderful things that they were going to do and all the wonderful things that they would never do, like sue the state or claim that the state didn't have jurisdiction over them. They also agreed, and the foolish state of Vermont, and I chide people about this one all the time, said to them, you know what? If you don't want to put any more money in the decommissioning fund, it's okay. We're going to let the market take care of it. The magic market is just going to make the decommissioning funds grow so that when it's time to clean up, you know, it'll all be taken care of and we'll never have to charge another dime to ratepayers to decommission the plant. And the state of Vermont said, yeah, all right. So there you have it. I have to say, you know, fast forward a little, the utilities were very happy. They had the biggest liability in their portfolio out of their hair. And the people from Entergy were being very nice. They were making electricity and the state was buying it. And everybody was happy. Now I hope I can work this right. Everybody was happy.